I was born 4 years after my sister, but in that house, I always felt like I came second in everything. Not second in time, but second in attention, in the way my parents looked at us, in the hopes they carried for their children. Vivian was the firstborn, the pride of the family, the story retold at every dinner and gathering. And I would sit quietly at the edge of those conversations, learning to eat softly and breathe lightly, afraid of accidentally stepping into a world that didn't quite belong to me. Whenever Vivian walked into the room, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter grew brighter, the questions more eager, the gazes warmer. When she talked about her day at school, everyone listened, nodding, marveling, asking for more. When I spoke, my stories often ended with a quick, mm-hmm, and the attention drifted back to her. At first, I tried harder. I spoke more, added details, hoping to hold on to that fragile thread of interest for just a little longer. But over time, I grew tired. I learned to fold into myself, like a leaf curling inward to keep from being torn by the wind. Some nights, I would lie on my old bed, staring at the ceiling cracked with faint lines, wondering what I had done wrong. I studied hard. I behaved. I caused no trouble. I cleaned, washed the dishes, helped my mother with small chores. I always believed that if I tried just a little more, my parents would finally see me. But it turns out, some distances cannot be closed with effort alone. They are not created out of cruelty, but out of a long-standing habit of love that has leaned too far in one direction for too long. My father used to joke in front of relatives, "Vivian is the smart one, and this one, well, she's just herself." Everyone would laugh. I laughed too, as if it were harmless. But each time, something very small inside me quietly cracked. It didn't hurt enough to make me cry, just enough to make my chest tighten, enough for me to remember it for a very long time. My mother was always busy, juggling 1,000 worries, and somewhere in that tangled list of priorities, my name was often the one pushed aside. No one ever said I wasn't important, but no one said I was either. I grew up in the shadow of invisible comparisons. My achievements, placed next to Vivian's, always seemed to fade. My efforts, standing beside her brightness, were easily eclipsed. Gradually, I stopped comparing myself to her. Instead, I compared myself only to who I had been the day before. I tried to live quietly, neatly, as if the smaller my presence became, the less burden I would be to the family. Sometimes, I wished I could disappear for a moment, just to see if anyone would notice the empty space I left behind. If this story touches you, comment 1. But the deepest pain wasn't being forgotten. The deepest pain was learning to accept being forgotten as something natural. I stopped waiting for praise. I stopped hoping for hugs. I stopped expecting to hear my name called with warmth. I grew used to standing at the edge of my own family's happiness. And in that long stretch of silence, I came to understand something. Some children do not grow up on words of love. They grow up on endurance. They are not loud. They do not demand. They simply mature in quietness, carrying delicate, invisible scratches so fine, so deep that no one ever sees. And I, Flora, the youngest child, forever standing in the shadow of my sister's overwhelming light, carried those scratches with me throughout my childhood. One day, they turned into a dull, steady ache, quietly flowing through my heart. It made no sound, but it never once stopped. I left that small town early one morning, when dew still clung to the old rooftops, and the road outside our house had not yet fully awakened. My suitcase was light, but my chest felt unbearably heavy, as if I were carrying an entire childhood filled with silence. I did not leave out of anger, nor out of resentment. I left because if I stayed, I was afraid I would slowly disappear so quietly that even I would no longer recognize who I was. Some pain is not loud, it does not explode. It gathers silently, little by little, until one day it becomes full enough to force you to walk away, if only to keep from dissolving inside the very house. On the morning I left, my father was crouched beneath the sink, fixing a leaking pipe. My mother stood in the kitchen, busy with a pot of soup simmering on the stove. No one truly looked at me. I stood at the doorway, waiting for a question, a piece of advice, or at least a small nod. But the only things I received were the metallic clinks of tools and the scent of food spreading through the air. In that moment, I understood that I could leave without creating any great emptiness behind me, and realizing that hurt more than any harsh words ever could. The bus carried me out of town, past the familiar fields and the rows of trees that had grown up alongside me. I watched them recede into the distance, as though my entire past were quietly slipping beyond my reach. Each bend in the road tightened something inside my chest. I had once dreamed of leaving this place, dreamed of a different life, one where no one compared me to my sister, where I could begin again. But when the moment finally arrived, it did not come with freedom. It came with a long, deep sadness that wove itself into every breath I took. In the new city, I learned how to live on my own. Cramped rented rooms, long shifts that stretched into the night, quick meals by a window blurred with steam. No one called my name in a familiar voice. No one asked if I was tired. But no one made me feel like an extra, either. Among strangers moving in every direction, I began to touch a strange, unfamiliar feeling. The right to exist fully. Each day, I reminded myself to be strong, not to prove anything to anyone, but simply to hold on to myself in a world where there were no family arms to lean on. If you're learning how to be strong on your own, comment 1. Some nights, after a late shift, I would curl up on my bed, hugging my knees, listening to the traffic humming outside. Homesickness would arrive without warning, like a cold draft slipping through a crack in the door. I missed the smell of the old kitchen. I missed the sound of familiar footsteps. I even missed the quiet evenings that once felt so heavy. But at the same time, I remembered very clearly what it felt like to be forgotten. Those two kinds of longing intertwined inside me, making my heart soften and ache all at once. I understood then that I had chosen this road not to run away, but to search for a place where I could simply be myself, not the shadow of anyone else. And so I stayed. I studied. I worked. I grew, little by little, among strangers. My hometown slowly became a distant memory, both tender and painful. With every step forward, I carried a silent promise. No matter how lonely it became, I would never return to being that small child again, shrinking into the dark corner of her own family. Far from home, I learned how to love in silence. There were no more shared dinners, no more familiar footsteps echoing down the narrow hallway, yet the invisible thread tying me to my family never truly broke. Every Sunday night, when the city slowly quieted, I would sit by my small window, placing my phone beside a cup of tea that had long gone cold, waiting for a call that usually never came. So I called first. My mother's voice on the other end was often tired, hurried, sometimes mixed with the sound of the television or dishes clattering in the background. My father rarely picked up. I grew used to the long, empty ringing tone and to leaving short messages. "I'm doing fine. Just wanted to check in." I never knew if those words were ever fully heard. I sent small packages home not because I had plenty, but because I was afraid the thread between us might wear thin. A wool scarf. I spent 3 weekends knitting for my mother. Vitamins for my father. A few small household items I thought might make their days a little easier. I wrapped everything carefully, writing each line on the card with steady hands, as if I were folding my longing into the paper itself. But most of those gifts disappeared into silence. No thank you. No message to say they had arrived. Only a long stretch of emptiness that made me wonder, more than once, was my love too light to reach them? There were moments when I wanted to stop. To see what would happen if I stopped calling, stopped sending, stopped remembering. Would they notice? But I could never bring myself to do it, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the old house. I saw my mother bending over the stove. I saw my father sitting at the worn wooden table with chipped edges. Those images forced me to keep caring, even in the smallest ways. I followed news from my hometown, asked distant relatives now and then, just to know they were healthy, that they were safe. Sometimes, hearing someone say, "Your parents are doing fine these days," was enough to make me exhale, as if I had just set down an invisible weight I'd been carrying all along. If you've ever sacrificed too much, comment 1. I learned how to care without waiting for a response. To care as a habit, like breathing, without needing to be seen. Some nights after a late shift, standing alone in an empty parking lot, I would still open my phone and scroll through old family photos. I would look at my father's smile, at the rare softness in my mother's eyes, and tell myself that even if they forgot me, I was not allowed to forget them. Perhaps that was the only way I could protect the softest part of myself in a cold and unfamiliar world. Every time I received my paycheck, I divided the money into small portions: rent, food, tuition, and a very small part for my family. It wasn't much, but it was saved from long shifts and exhausting overtime hours. I thought of my parents each time I signed a transfer receipt, as if I were sending a silent greeting along with the money. I never told anyone. I never expected recognition. Just knowing they might live a little more comfortably was enough to lighten my heart. But loving in silence is also a kind of loneliness. The more I gave, the more I realized how far away I stood. I wasn't there for family dinners, holidays, or reunions. I existed only through packages, brief phone calls, and anonymous bank transfers. Sometimes I feared I was slowly becoming a fading name in their memory. Yet even that fear was not strong enough to make me turn away. Deep down, I was still that little youngest child, always turning toward the old house with all the love I had. No matter how far the distance stretched, no matter how heavy the wounds became, I chose to remain on this side of gentleness, quietly holding up a support for my family that they never even knew existed. And perhaps it was that silence that became the softest pain, yet also the most enduring one, following me through all my years away from home. The call came on a gray afternoon. The city lights had just flickered on, and I was standing still by a hospital window, watching thin streaks of rain slide down the glass. On the other end, Aunt Martha's voice was low and trembling, as if each word had to push through a thick wall of restraint before it could escape. "Your parents, they're about to lose the house." I didn't manage to ask anything else. The sentence fell like a stone, heavy and sudden, dragging my heart down with it. My hands turned cold. In that moment, every sound around me dissolved. There was only my racing heartbeat and a vague fear spreading slowly, deeply inside my chest. I thought of the old house on Maple Street, the place that had quietly witnessed my entire childhood. The low porch roof, the rusted iron fence, the chipped corner of the front step worn down by time. It was not a beautiful house, but it was the only place my parents had ever called home. The thought of them having to leave it made something inside me ache sharply, as if an invisible hand had tightened around my heart. I pictured my father silently packing up their belongings, my mother standing in the middle of an empty room, unsure where to place years of memories that no longer had walls to hold them. The image stole the air from my lungs. Aunt Martha explained that my parents had fallen behind on their bank payments for months. The reminder letters had grown thicker, their tone colder. My father had told no one. My mother hid her worries behind a calm face, and Vivian, the one who usually stepped forward to handle everything, had said she would take care of it. I listened, but a strange unease rose inside me. Part of me wanted to believe everything would be fine, that this was only a small wave passing through. But another part understood that some waves gather quietly beneath the surface until the day they break and sweep everything away. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the small table in my rented apartment, staring at the numbers in my bank account. My modest savings, the paycheck I had just received, the bills waiting to be paid. Life in a foreign city was already tight. Every dollar I earned had cost me long shifts and aching shoulders. But when I thought of that house of my parents slowly running out of hope, I knew I couldn't stand still. There are moments when you are forced to choose between your own safety and someone else's fear. And I, for a long time now, had grown used to choosing the harder part. The next morning, I called the bank back home. The man on the other end spoke in a calm, professional tone, reading out the dry numbers: 3 months overdue, foreclosure procedures underway. Each word felt like a small blade, slicing away the last of my illusions. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, emptiness spreading through my body. I understood that if I did nothing right now, that house would soon become nothing more than a memory. I didn't call my parents, not because I was angry, but because I was afraid they would refuse. Afraid of my father's pride, my mother's quiet endurance, and the habit of silent suffering that had shaped them for decades. I didn't tell Vivian either. Some truths, if spoken too soon, only make things more complicated. So I quietly began rearranging my own life, calculating every expense, every possible option. And among those cold, unforgiving numbers, one truth became painfully clear. If I wanted to save that roof over my parents' heads, I would have to give up a great deal of my own. When the decision was made, I didn't feel relieved. If anything, my heart grew heavier, as though I had placed another burden onto already tired shoulders. And yet, at the same time, there was a strange calm inside me. Like when you accept that you are about to walk into heavy rain, you stop being afraid of getting wet. You simply keep moving forward. I understood that from this moment on, my path would be harder, longer, and lonelier. But if it meant keeping a roof over my parents' heads, I was willing. Outside, the rain kept falling fine, steady, persistent. I stood up, made myself a cup of hot tea, took a deep breath, and began writing down the first numbers of a repayment plan. In the quiet room, there was only the faint scratch of my pen and the steady rhythm of my breathing. Somewhere far away, the old house was still standing fragile, waiting. I had wanted to trust Vivian. I truly had. When Aunt Martha said that Vivian had stepped forward, that she promised to handle everything with the bank, a fragile sense of relief had settled inside me. I thought maybe I had worried too much. Maybe she had grown up. Maybe she had learned how to carry responsibility. I let myself believe it, even though that belief was as thin as morning mist. One ray of sunlight could dissolve it. Still, I clung to it. I needed to believe that our family could still lean on one another. Then a phone call from the bank shattered everything. The manager's voice was calm as he informed me that the account had not received any payment, not a single dollar, no trace of the "I'll take care of it" Vivian had promised. I sat there in silence, my hand tightening around the phone. It felt as if something cold were spreading through my chest. In that moment, I wasn't angry. I just felt empty, like the last piece of trust inside me had quietly collapsed. No noise, no drama, just a pain that sank all the way into the bone. I tried to find a gentle explanation for her. Maybe she was busy. Maybe she was struggling. Maybe she was just a little late. But the days passed in silence, and the numbers in the bank report remained unchanged, cold, unmoving, like a quiet confirmation. Slowly, I had to face a truth that was hard to swallow. She had lied. Not a careless lie spoken in haste, but a deliberate silence long enough for everyone to believe the problem had already been solved. What hurt me wasn't the money. I could work more hours. I could tighten my spending. I could endure a little more hardship. What hurt was the feeling of betrayal from the very person I had once admired, once sheltered in my heart throughout my childhood. Vivian had been my role model, the one I followed step by step, the one whose shadow I never minded standing in. And now, she stood somewhere far away, a place where truth and responsibility no longer seemed to reach. I thought of my parents. They believed her, completely. The way people believe that morning light will always follow a long night. They had no idea that while they slept peacefully beneath that fragile roof, a wide crack was opening beneath their feet. The thought tightened my chest. I couldn't bear to tell them. I couldn't bear to shatter the rare sense of reassurance they still had. So, I chose silence. I chose to carry the responsibility that should have been hers. Some nights, I found myself wondering what had changed her. Pressure? Ambition? Or simply selfishness, nurtured for too long? I didn't have the answers. I only knew that from that moment on, the thread between us had developed a thin fracture almost invisible, but deep enough that light could no longer pass through it completely. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't accuse. I didn't question. I simply did what needed to be done, quietly, like mending an old shirt in the dark so no one would see the clumsy stitches. And in that silence I understood something. Some pain doesn't need to scream. It only needs to exist quietly, growing little by little until it becomes part of your heart. For 5 years, I lived 2 parallel lives, silently and without anyone knowing. By day, I was just another ordinary girl in a distant city, burying myself in long shifts, endless overtime, late bus rides back to a cramped rented room. By night, when the world had gone still, I would sit in front of my phone screen, staring at the number $2,300 glowing each month before pressing transfer, like a ritual repeated over and over, steady and resigned. I told no one, not because I was noble, but because I was afraid. Afraid that once spoken aloud, the sacrifice would grow heavier, that it would turn into an expectation, an invisible pressure. And I didn't want that. Every time I sent the money, I would pause for a long moment, not out of regret, but to ask myself, would this be enough to keep the old house standing, the house where I grew up in silence and quiet hurt? Would it be enough to hold on to a family I had never quite felt I belonged to? There were no answers. I only knew that if I didn't do it, the house would disappear, and with it, a fragile piece of memory I was still trying to protect, even if those memories held more pain than joy. My life narrowed down to numbers, bills, sleepless nights, and hurried meals. I learned to be ruthless with myself when it came to saving money. I bought clothes only when absolutely necessary. Some days, dinner was just instant noodles and a single egg. I grew used to giving away the easiest comforts and keeping the smallest portions for myself. And yet, strangely, within that scarcity, I found a fragile kind of peace. The feeling that I could still do something for my family, even from far away, even if no one ever saw it. Some nights, after finishing the transfer, I would lie still in the dark, listening to the faint rhythm of my own heartbeat. I would think about my parents, about the old house with its stained walls, low porch roof, and the almond tree standing by the gate. I wondered whether they knew that every brick, every step, every familiar corner was being held together by my exhaustion, month after month. Then I would smile to myself. What would be the point of them knowing, when all my life I had grown used to not being seen, not being called by name in the moments that mattered? 5 years passed like a long, weary blink. I aged faster than my years, carrying a weight no one shared. There were times I thought I could not go on. I would stand for a long time by the window, watching the night traffic flow past, asking myself whether I was living my own life or merely repaying a debt for something that had never truly belonged to me. But every time I imagined the house sealed by the bank, my parents left without a place to return to, my chest would tighten and I would continue. I never asked for recognition. I only hoped that one day, when I returned, the house would still be there, a quiet proof that I had not let go. Yet deep inside, I also longed to be seen, just once, to be asked how I was, even in a single sentence. Perhaps the deepest pain was not the money I had paid, but the feeling that I had given everything while still standing at the edge of love. And so, month after month, I quietly kept the roof over someone else's head, while I drifted through my own long days carrying a sadness that was soft, deep, and almost impossible to name. When I finally sat down and added everything up, the number on the screen made my heart go still. Over $137,000. A dry, indifferent row of digits. Cold, precise, empty of emotion. And yet behind it lay 5 full years of a human life, sleep broken into fragments, hurried meals swallowed without taste, dreams carefully folded away with no date set to return. I stared at that number for a long time, not in regret, but in quiet disbelief at how far I had walked silently and alone. $137,000. It was not just my salary. It was my youth compressed into endless shifts that left my body trembling with exhaustion. It was mornings when I left before the sun rose, and nights when I returned only after the city lights had already come on. It was weekends I did not dare to rest, because every hour not worked meant the transfer home would be just a little smaller. I grew so used to that relentless rhythm that on the rare day off, I felt strangely hollow, as if I no longer remembered how to live slowly. Every dollar I sent carried a tiny piece of sacrifice, but when those pieces were gathered together, they became something enormous, almost crushing. I gave up proper meals, dresses I once paused to admire in shop windows, small trips I had quietly dreamed about. I postponed further studies. I delayed the idea of renting a better place of my own. I set aside even the simplest wishes of a young woman to live for herself, if only once. Over time, I became accustomed to not wanting too much. I learned to treat absence as normal, to look at what I did not have and tell myself it was unnecessary. I convinced myself that this narrowing of my world was temporary, that it was meaningful, and perhaps it was. But meaning does not erase fatigue. Purpose does not soften loneliness. Sometimes I wonder what $137,000 would look like if it could take shape. Would it resemble a roof still standing, a kitchen light left on at night, my parents sleeping without fear of losing their home? I hope so. I hold on to that hope carefully, because without it, the number would be too heavy to carry. What aches the most is not the money itself, it is the realization that those 5 years will never return. Youth does not refund itself, time does not accumulate interest. I gave away something far more fragile than currency. I gave away seasons of my own becoming. And yet, when I close my eyes, I know I would make the same choice again. Not because I am strong, not because I am noble, but because somewhere deep inside, I am still that youngest child, quietly trying to earn a place in a house that never fully made room for her. On nights when the rain taps softly against the tin roof, I lie awake and think about the money that has slipped away, and an odd emptiness spreads through me. I ask myself whether life might have been less harsh if, back then, I had chosen to keep it for myself. But then, I remember the old house, my parents growing older with each passing day, the quiet years in which I was raised, and I know I could never have turned my back. That choice, however painful, was the only one I could make. $137,000 became a measure of silence. 5 years without a single question of concern, without a word of thanks, without anyone wondering why I always lived so sparingly. I stood behind everything like a familiar shadow, fulfilling my duty and then quietly stepping away. Sometimes I wished someone would notice not to praise me, but simply to let me know that those sacrifices were not entirely meaningless. And so, in the vast current of life, I left behind more than $137,000, along with a very large part of myself. I do not regret it, but I cannot say it did not hurt. Because throughout that journey, I learned how to give, but I never learned how to keep anything back for myself. A little tenderness, a little peace, and a small place to be loved. The day I heard that Vivian stood in the living room and calmly said she had taken care of everything, my heart seemed to pause for a brief second before dropping very deep. There was no loud noise, no dramatic moment, just a vague stillness spreading across my chest, cold and hollow. I sat silently before my phone screen, listening to my parents' emotional voices, hearing the waves of praise, pride, and gratitude directed at her, and I did not know how to respond. In that moment, I realized that some kinds of pain do not make you cry. They simply render you silent, like a leaf falling into deep water without leaving a ripple. Vivian spoke so naturally, as if the story had always belonged to her. She talked about the exhausting months, the quiet sacrifices, the desperate attempts to make ends meet. Every sentence, every word, mirrored exactly what I had lived through, except for one thing. The person standing at the center of that story was not me. I wasn't angry. Strangely, I didn't feel anger at all. What I felt was a deep, consuming weariness, as though I had just walked a very long road and no longer had the strength to turn back. The entire family burst into praise. They called Vivian a devoted daughter, the pride of the family, a role model for the next generation. Their words floated through the air, light and radiant, while I sat far away, quietly gathering the broken pieces inside my chest. I wondered, if they knew the truth, would anyone turn to look at me? Or would I still remain a faint name in a long list of relatives, easily overlooked? My parents' eyes brimmed with tears as they held her hands tightly, thanking her, saying that from now on they could feel at peace, that they could finally hold their heads high. Watching that scene, my heart tightened not out of jealousy, but from a vague sense of loss. I realized then that what I had longed for all these years was not recognition or praise, but acknowledgement that I, too, had tried, that I, too, had loved in the most clumsy and imperfect way I knew how. But the moment passed quickly, like a blink, and I returned to my familiar place, behind everyone else. I chose silence. Not because I was noble, but because I was too tired to explain and too afraid of shattering my parents' fragile joy. There are truths that, once spoken, do not bring justice, only more wounds. So I swallowed everything, allowing my efforts to drift toward someone else, like a river quietly changing its course. And amid the bright, ringing laughter of my family, I sat there quiet and small, learning to accept that sometimes love also means stepping back, letting someone else stand in the light while I remain in the familiar darkness, carrying a pain that is soft, deep, and unending. When the final loan was paid off, the house seemed to release an invisible burden. I did not. I had thought that after everything, the distance between me and my family would finally narrow, that the silent years of sacrifice would earn me at least a small place enough for my name to be spoken. But no. The hurt merely shifted into another form, more subtle, more cold. And this time, the one pushing me away was not fate, but Vivian. She began with very small things. Family gatherings arranged without my knowing. Warm dinners that appeared only in hurried photographs posted online as proof of happiness. I saw my parents smiling. Relatives gathered close, and in those frames, there was no place for me. At first, I told myself it was coincidence, but then it happened again, and again. Eventually, I understood that I was being eased out quietly, deliberately. Vivian told my parents that I was busy, that living far away made it inconvenient for me to return. She made decisions on my behalf, crossing my name out of family moments as though my absence were only natural. I was neither asked nor given a choice. I learned about everything through fragments of news, through someone else's retelling, through images that felt both foreign and painfully familiar. Each time, something inside me tightened just a little, not enough to make me cry, but enough to ache through the night and keep sleep far away. Once, I gathered all my courage and called my mother to ask why no one had told me about grandfather's death anniversary. On the other end of the line, she was silent for a few seconds before softly saying that Vivian had told her I was busy with work, that she was afraid of disturbing me. The answer was so gentle it left no space for blame, and yet it was sharp as a thin blade. It was then I understood that, in everyone's mind, my existence could be so easily replaced by a convenient explanation. I slowly began to realize that when someone grows accustomed to standing at the center, they fear any other light that might touch that place. And the simplest way to protect their glow is to push the other person away. Vivian did not need to speak ill of me, nor invent grand stories. She only needed to let me fade from the family's daily life, little by little, until my absence felt natural. What hurt me most was not her calculation, but my parents' silence. They did not question, did not doubt, did not once turn to look toward me. They accepted the story as it was told, and without meaning to, they helped erase their youngest daughter. I do not blame them. I only feel a deep sadness in realizing that sometimes family bonds are as fragile as morning mist, one light breeze, and they disappear. And so, after the house was saved, I lost another home, the home of belonging. I stood outside a door that had once been so familiar, quietly looking in, carrying a tired heart, learning to accept that some families do not push you out with harsh words, but with forgetfulness slow, quiet, and painful enough to leave you speechless. The decision to return for my parents' 40th wedding anniversary came to me on a very quiet evening. The city outside was as noisy as ever, but inside my small room, I sat still for hours, staring at the train ticket I had just booked, my heart swaying somewhere between hope and fear. I did not know what I expected from this journey, a word of acknowledgement, a belated embrace, or simply a full stop to the waiting that had stretched across so many years. But I knew that if I did not go back, I would carry that unanswered question with me for the rest of my life. 40 years, a stretch of time long enough for two people to build and preserve a family, and also long enough for small affections to wear thin. I wondered whether, at that formal celebration, anyone would still remember me, or whether my name had already faded like an unnecessary detail. The thought tightened my chest, yet it also gave me a strange resolve. I wanted to be there, not to compete or demand anything, but to face them, to face my family, and to face myself. In the days of preparation, I lived in a state that felt unfamiliar and fragile. I chose a simple dress, neither too striking nor too dull, the way I had always tried to exist among others. I folded a few outfits neatly, arranged some old keepsakes to bring along, and then paused in front of a family photograph taken many years ago. In that picture, I stood at the edge of the frame, half of my body obscured, my gaze turned elsewhere. The image made me smile sadly. It seemed that from the very beginning, I had already grown used to standing on the margins. On the train back to my hometown, I rested my forehead lightly against the window and let the fields, the rows of houses, the familiar roads drift away and then draw close again. Each passing landscape stirred an old fragment of memory at once, intimate and distant. I remembered afternoons studying by the veranda, the scent of freshly cooked rice, the sound of my father's dry cough on windy nights. But woven into those memories were long stretches of silence, dinners where my voice was absent, moments when my name was forgotten in lists of important things. Memory layered upon memory, warmth interlaced with cold, until my heart felt unbearably heavy. I did not know what would be waiting for me when I stepped into that house. A distracted greeting, a surprised glance, or a silence stretched thin and taut. I did not know whether I would be calm enough to smile, strong enough to remain steady beneath indifferent eyes. Still, I went. Because some returns are not meant to seek happiness, but to close wounds that have never truly healed. And so, carrying a heart filled with fear and a fragile thread of hope, I boarded that train, telling myself that no matter how it ended, at least I had given myself the chance to be present fully, clearly, no longer hiding in someone else's shadow. Inside the small handbag beside me was a thin box, carefully wrapped in plain brown paper. No one knew what it held, and I had no intention of letting anyone guess. Yet to me, that box weighed more than any other piece of luggage. It contained every proof of the 5 years I had quietly paid the mortgage, copies of bank transfers, receipts, cold confirmation emails, dry numbers lined up month after month. Each sheet of paper was a thin slice of my life, fragile yet sharp as a blade. I hesitated for a long time before deciding to bring it with me. There were nights when I opened the box, arranged each sheet of paper carefully, then closed it again, as if merely touching them could summon every exhausted memory at once and leave me breathless. I once believed I would never use them, that silence was the gentlest way to preserve the fragile peace we still had. But the closer the day of my return came, the more I understood that some truths, if left unspoken, would slowly gnaw at me until there was nothing left. I did not need recognition, but I needed freedom. The box lay quietly in my bag, resting against my side. With every movement of the train, I felt its presence distinctly, like a second heartbeat, slow and heavy. I was afraid. Afraid of the moment I would have to open it. Afraid of the looks on their faces when they saw what was inside. Afraid of the rapid questions, the disbelief. But deeper than all of that was another fear. That even with proof in my hands, the truth could still be denied, blurred, erased, just as I had been blurred for so many years. I imagined the anniversary celebration, the house filled with people, laughter spilling into every corner, and I would walk in carrying a small, unremarkable box, standing before an entire family. With a single moment, a quiet lifting of the lid, everything could change. The praise that had long surrounded Vivian might crumble. The beliefs they had held so firmly might fracture. And I, the one who had always stood at the edge, could suddenly be pulled into the center of a storm I was not sure I was strong enough to endure. Every sheet of paper inside that box was a testimony, not to accuse, but to tell another version of the story of a youngest daughter living far away, quietly gathering each paycheck, trimming away her own dreams, just to preserve a house that had never truly sheltered her. But I knew that once the truth was placed on the table, it would no longer belong to me alone. It would become a blade dividing relationships already fragile, and perhaps I would be the one cut the deepest. The train moved slowly past small stations. I sat still, fingers intertwined, feeling each passing second stretch longer than it should. Inside my head, two voices wrestled without rest. One urged me to remain silent, as I always had to let everything stay peaceful, even if it meant continuing to disappear. The other whispered that it was time to step out of the shadows, whatever the cost. Their struggle tightened in my chest until it ached, as if an unseen hand were squeezing the air from my lungs. The box pressed lightly against my side, reminding me that this choice was real, that there was no turning back. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath, letting tears slip down quietly. Not from weakness, but because I understood that when I placed that box on the table in the house of my childhood, a large part of my life would be laid bare, exposed and trembling. Even before the moment arrived, my heart was already shaking, holding its breath for a wave I could not avoid. I stood in a room full of people, the small box in my hands feeling like the edge of a bottomless cliff. The laughter faded when I began to speak. I did not say much. I simply set the box down on the table and lifted the lid, revealing the thin, pale sheets resting silently atop one another. I believed that once the truth was seen, everything would change. But I was wrong. I had forgotten that in some places, truth is not always welcomed. My father was the first to speak. His voice was low, but sharp as a blade. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing, why I had brought such meaningless things to ruin the family's celebration. I had not even managed to explain when my mother burst into tears and turned her face away, as if I had committed an unforgivable sin. The eyes around me began to change, curiosity turning into irritation, attentiveness dissolving into quiet contempt. I stood there, silent, feeling as though layers of my skin were being stripped away in front of everyone. Vivian did not say much. She simply stood beside my parents, placing a hand gently on my mother's shoulder and shaking her head ever so slightly. That gesture, so small it was almost invisible, cut deeper than anything else. It was a silent declaration that my story was not to be believed, that I was merely seeking attention. And just like that, in a single instant, 5 years of effort were swept aside, replaced by the image of a selfish, calculating, unfilial daughter. My father's voice trembled with anger. "Don't you see what day this is? How could you do this in front of the relatives?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. In my throat was a hard knot, hot and bitter. I wanted to say that I had no intention of destroying anything, that I only wanted them to know the truth, that I wanted them to understand how I had lived all those years. But standing beneath my parents' cold gaze, those words suddenly felt small and meaningless. Then the sentence came, slow and clear. "If you continue, you can leave." There was no hesitation, no trace of mercy. As if I were not their flesh and blood, but an uninvited guest who had wandered into a celebration that was never meant for her. I stood motionless, feeling the ground beneath my feet give way. Everything I had endured, sacrificed, preserved, all of it was denied in that single moment, as though it had never existed at all. Whispers began to ripple through the room. Some people looked at me with pity, some turned away to avoid my eyes, others shook their heads faintly. No one spoke up in my defense. No one asked if I was all right. I stood there in a crowded room and felt utterly alone. Alone like the child I once was, sitting quietly at the corner of the table, waiting for someone to notice and pass her a small piece of food. I bent down to gather the papers that had slipped from the box. My hands trembled. The thin sheets clung to one another, as if trying to hold on to something already shattered. I did not cry. My tears had dried up long ago. Inside me there was only an expanding emptiness, cold and spreading through my body. I realized then that some pains do not explode, they widen silently until there is no space left for hope. Before turning away, I looked at my parents one last time. They were still standing beside Vivian, wrapped in the arms of relatives, surrounded by congratulations and pride, and I stood at the edge of the light, like a fading shadow. It came to me with sudden clarity that all these years I had tried to step into their world, yet that door had never truly been open for me. I stepped outside. The door closed behind me, cutting off the noise inside, leaving only a vast stillness. Cold wind brushed past, carrying the damp scent of night. I stood on the front steps for a long time, feeling as though I had just been pushed out of a part of life that once meant everything. The wound was so deep I did not know how to name it. I only knew that in that moment of humiliation and exile, I had lost not just a family, but the last fragile belief that sacrifice would one day be understood. I had just stepped off the final stair when Aunt Martha's voice rose behind me, not loud, but firm enough to slice through the heavy air inside the house. She did not shout. She did not scold. She simply said, very slowly, "Wait." The entire room froze. The murmurs fell silent, as if someone had gently turned down the volume of the world. Aunt Martha stepped forward, her small frame upright, her gaze strangely calm. In her hand was an old phone. One corner of the screen cracked, yet the numbers displayed upon it were painfully clear. She did not look at me. She did not look at Vivian. She looked straight at my parents, her voice steady, each word falling like pebbles into still water. She spoke of the times I had called her, asking her to keep important documents safe. Of the evenings I sat at her kitchen table, sorting through transfer receipts, afraid of making the smallest mistake. She spoke of 5 years, $2,300 every month, never once late. One by one, she opened the images, the copies, passing the phone to those standing closest. The numbers appeared bare and cold, requiring no explanation. The air in the room began to shift. Doubt turned into stunned silence. Faint shakes of the head dissolved into a heaviness that pressed against the walls. I stood near the doorway, listening. It felt as though someone were gently unwrapping the tight bandages around my heart, painful, yet relieving. My parents said nothing. The anger that had flared moments ago drained away, replaced by something hollow and uncertain. My mother lifted her hand to her mouth. Her eyes rimmed red. My father stood motionless, his gaze unsteady, as though he were trying to rearrange a story he had believed for years. And Vivian, she stepped back half a pace. The calm composure she always wore slipped for a fleeting second, revealing confusion before she quickly masked it again. Aunt Martha did not accuse anyone. She only said, softly, that sometimes the quietest children carry the heaviest burdens. That sacrifice without noise is often forgotten, and prolonged silence can bury the truth. Then she turned to me, her eyes gentler now, like the lightest touch, and said, "She never asked for anything. She only wanted to keep a roof over her parents' heads." In that stillness, I felt something fragile shift inside the room, not triumph, not vindication, but a quiet cracking of illusions. For the first time in years, my name was no longer drifting unseen between conversations. It was there, spoken aloud, attached to the weight it had always carried. And though the pain had not disappeared, it no longer felt invisible. In that instant, the spacious room seemed to shrink. The congratulations from moments before dissolved into the heavy sound of regret and confusion. A few people lowered their heads, avoiding my eyes. Others fidgeted awkwardly, unsure of what to say. There was no applause now, no words of praise. Only the truth stood bare in the center of the room, unyielding. I did not step back inside. I remained at the threshold, letting the words pass through me like a late rain. I felt no triumph, nor did I feel complete relief. There was only a deep sadness, because truth once spoken cannot erase the scars it reveals. But at least, in that moment, I knew I was no longer invisible. And that, to me, was a fragile kind of freedom. The room sank into a silence unlike any it had known before, as if every sound had been drained away in a single breath. When Aunt Martha finished speaking, no one added another word. Familiar faces so recently bright with laughter and praise now held only shock, confusion, and a hollow uncertainty. Truth, when uncovered, does not need to shout. It does not rage. Yet it can still shake an entire small world. My mother was the first to sink into a chair, her trembling hand pressed against her chest, as though trying to steady a heartbeat that had lost its rhythm. When she looked at me, there was no accusation left in her eyes, only a pain too complex to name. Perhaps, in that moment, she saw the years I had walked through without her truly walking beside me. Each passing month, each transfer sent home, each restless night in a foreign land. All of it surfaced slowly, mercilessly clear. And alongside that truth came another loss, one that could not be undone. The loss of closeness, of shared years, of chances to understand. The loss of a daughter she had believed she held securely in her hands, only to realize she had never really seen the weight those hands were carrying. My father stood in silence, his shoulders seeming to bear a sudden, invisible weight. He looked at the papers on the table, then at me, his gaze wavering between disbelief and remorse. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he realized how his sternness and silence had unknowingly pushed me farther away than he ever meant to. The words he once spoke, the times he turned his face aside, the moments he chose to trust others more than his own daughter, all of it now piled up inside that single glance, heavy and suffocating. The truth did not merely expose a story, it revealed an empty space where love might have lived. Vivian stood motionless, her face drained of color. She did not cry, nor did she attempt to defend herself. Her eyes looked lost, as though she had misplaced something immense, not only the admiration of everyone in the room, but her own sense of certainty. Perhaps in that instant, she finally understood that the praise she had received for years had been built upon someone else's silence and sacrifice. And that truth, even without accusation or raised voices, was enough to make her collapse inwardly. The relatives around us began quietly avoiding my eyes. No one mentioned the compliments from earlier. The air in the room grew heavy, almost suffocating. Each person seemed to be confronting a private loss. The loss of an old belief, of an image once thought beautiful, of the easy reassurance they had grown comfortable with. And within that shared unraveling, I suddenly felt strangely small, as though everything I had done had led only to this single, belated moment of stunned realization. I stood there in silence, unsure whether to step inside or turn away. There was no sense of victory in me, no resentment either, only a deep sadness, because I understood that even though the truth had finally been spoken, those lonely years could never return. The meals where my name was never called, the nights I faced exhaustion alone, the dreams quietly set aside. They remained, like silent scars that no apology could erase. And in that room full of people, I realized something painfully clear. There are truths that, once known, do not bring complete comfort. They only make us more aware of the losses that can never be undone. Vivian stood there, in the very room that had once echoed with praise for her, now thick with an almost suffocating silence. The truth had not arrived with drama or raised voices. It had come quietly, cleanly, yet it cut through the polished image she had worn for years. One by one, eyes turned toward her. No longer filled with admiration or trust, they now held surprise, disappointment, and a cold thread of doubt. The relatives who once gathered around her, who had spoken her name with pride, now quietly stepped back. No one voiced a single accusation, yet that very silence became the heaviest sentence of all. Vivian seemed placed at the center of an invisible circle, where every glance was a question that required no answer, every subtle shake of the head an unspoken judgment. Everything she had painstakingly built the image of the devoted daughter, the exemplary sister. The family's pride collapsed all at once, swift and cold, like a sandcastle swept away by an unseen tide. I looked at her, and no sense of triumph rose within me, only a deep sorrow, because I knew that to hold on to that position, she must have lived with a constant fear of being replaced, overshadowed, forgotten. And it was that fear that led her into the wrong choices. When the truth was uncovered, what she lost was not merely her reputation, but the final protective layer shielding her fragile self-worth. My parents looked at Vivian differently now. The pride was gone, the unwavering trust dissolved. What remained was a disappointment too heavy to conceal. My mother turned away slightly, as if she did not have the courage to face it. My father stood still, his hands clenched tightly, deeper lines etched across his face. Perhaps in that moment, they did not only lose a belief, they realized they had unknowingly nurtured a distance far too wide between their two daughters. Vivian lowered her head. It was the first time I had ever seen her look so small. The shoulders that once stood straight had fallen. The eyes that once carried quiet pride were now dim and unmoored. She did not cry, yet her expression hurt more than tears would have. The collapse did not come with shouting or protest, but in a long, stretching silence where every defense felt pointless. There are moments when truth does not need to argue for itself, it stands firm under the sheer weight of what it carries. Vivian's credibility vanished in an instant, but its aftershocks spread slowly. They seeped into every glance, every whisper, every subtle distance that formed between people. She was no longer the center of admiration. She became a name spoken with caution. And in that shift, I realized something profoundly sad. Honor built upon someone else's silence and sacrifice will inevitably collapse. And when it does, the wounds it leaves behind are often far deeper than its polished surface ever suggested. I stood there quietly, saying nothing. Because in the moment Vivian lost everything she had carefully protected, I did not feel victorious. I only saw a family that had just lost another fragment of its peace, and a sister who had lost herself in the very things she once tried so hard to hold on to. The news that my parents had driven 14 hours to find me came early one morning, when the city was still drowsy beneath a thin layer of mist. I stood by the window, looking down at the long, empty road below, feeling something inside me shift slowly, heavy, yet fragile. 14 hours. Long enough for a person to confront themselves. Long enough for every thought, every memory, every mistake to rise to the surface without escape. When the old car finally stopped in front of my building, I watched my parents step out, their movements weary. My mother had grown noticeably thinner, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep. My father seemed more bent than before, as if the long journey had etched itself into his muscles and deepened every line on his face. They stood there awkwardly, hesitant like strangers unsure how to begin a conversation that had been left unfinished for far too long. I walked out and stood only a short distance from them, yet the space between us felt immeasurable. My mother spoke first. Her voice was hoarse and trembling. She managed only to call my name before it broke in her throat. Flora. The two soft syllables fell so gently, yet they pierced my heart. How long had it been since I'd heard her call my name with such longing? My father stood beside her in silence, his calloused hands clasped tightly together. In his eyes, I saw a depth of regret, heavier than any spoken apology could have carried. They told me about the long drive through the night, about the times they had to pull over on the highway just to steady themselves, about the same questions circling endlessly without answers. Why hadn't they noticed? Why had they trusted the wrong version of the story? Why had they left me alone for so many years? Each question felt like a small needle pressing into old wounds, stirring both pain and tenderness. I listened without interrupting, letting the words they had never said finally flow out slow, hesitant, and far too late. My mother reached for my hand, her thin fingers trembling. She apologized again and again, as if saying it only once would never be enough to mend what had been broken. She said she had grown so used to my silence that she forgot I, too, needed to be heard. That she had allowed the brilliance of one child to cast a shadow over the other, and paid for it with years that could never be reclaimed. Her tears fell onto the back of my hand, warm and salty, and something inside me wavered. My father lowered his head. A man who had spent his entire life sparing with apologies, now stood before his daughter and quietly said, "I was wrong." His voice was rough, as though it had traveled through a long, unrelenting storm. I looked at him, and suddenly noticed how much more bent his back seemed, how much whiter his hair had grown. The firmness that once defined his gaze had given way to exhaustion. Regret, when it arrives late, cannot turn time backward, but it can age a person in an instant. We stood there for a long while in the small courtyard, letting the early sunlight spill gently across our faces. No one rushed to speak about the future, no one dissected the past in detail. There were only stretches of silence between us, quiet, fragile, but honest enough for me to understand that their 14-hour journey was not meant to demand immediate forgiveness. It was meant to begin learning how to face the losses they themselves had caused. I did not know how much I could truly forgive. Some wounds had become part of me, woven into who I was, not easily erased. But in the moment, I saw my parents standing at my door exhausted. Remorseful, I understood that their regret was real. And perhaps the road toward healing, however long and slow, had already begun with that 14-hour drive through the night. The days that followed moved gently, as if time itself had learned to tread more softly, careful not to reopen the cracks that had only just been touched. Our family began the work of mending through the smallest of gestures, so small they might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. An evening call just to ask whether I had eaten. A brief message from my mother reminding me to dress warmly when the weather turned cold. One day, my father quietly sent me a photo of the old house, with a simple line beneath it. "Home is fine." These gestures were awkward, unpolished, but carried a raw sincerity like trembling hands relearning how to love. We did not speak much about the past, not because we wanted to forget, but because we feared that touching it too directly would make it ache again. Some wounds, even when acknowledged, need time to close. Instead, we told each other about ordinary days. I spoke about my work, about the small room where I lived, about evenings when I left the office late. My mother talked about the vegetable garden behind the house, about meals now shared by just two people, about my father's new habit of walking around the neighborhood each morning. My father listened more than he spoke, but now and then he would add a short comment. as though afraid of missing even a single piece of my life. Sometimes, in the middle of a half-finished sentence, we would fall silent together. It was not an awkward silence, but a gentle one, soft enough to simply feel each other's presence. In those moments, I noticed my heart loosen slightly, my breathing grow slower. After so many years of distance, we were learning again how to sit beside one another, without fear, without defense. Each time I returned home, I saw how much my parents had changed. They listened more, they asked more, they weighed their words with care. There were no more careless comparisons, no more decisions made on my behalf. I was asked. I was given choices. I was allowed to refuse. These things might have seemed small to others, but to me, they carried immense, meaning a quiet, overdue acknowledgement that I, too, was an essential part of this family. Vivian and I still kept a certain distance. She spoke less than before, her gaze quieter, more subdued. We could not return to what we once were, but the silence between us was no longer sharp. It held no thorns, only caution, and a quiet sadness. Perhaps healing the layered wounds between two sisters would require even more time, but at least we no longer avoided each other, and that alone felt like a long step forward. I do not believe in miracles. I understand now that healing is not about erasing the past, but about learning to live with it through understanding and compassion. There are days when the old sadness returns softly, like a sudden cold wind. Yet in late-night calls, in the rare meals we share together, I feel an invisible thread, slowly being tied again, fragile, yes, but real. And in that slow, fragile journey, I learned something important. Family love, no matter how deeply wounded, still has the power to revive if people are brave enough to face the truth, patient enough to wait, and gentle enough to reach for each other once more. I set my boundaries on a quiet afternoon, when the last light of day spilled softly across the windowsill. A strange clarity rose within me. I could not continue living the way I had before. Not out of resentment, not to punish anyone, but because I was exhausted from being overlooked, underestimated, placed last in every choice. I understood that if I did not protect myself, then no matter how much love existed, I would always be the one who bore the deepest wounds. When I said it to my parents, my voice was neither loud nor sharp. I spoke slowly, clearly, almost as if reminding myself, I can't accept being treated as less anymore. The words fell into the small room like a leaf drifting down soft, but carrying the weight of an entire lifetime of silence. I did not accuse. I did not list sacrifices. I did not reopen old accounts. I spoke only about how it felt, always yielding, always standing behind, always trying to be seen, yet somehow remaining invisible. This time, they truly listened. They did not interrupt. They did not defend themselves. They did not deny what I felt. In their eyes, I saw a deep sadness threaded with regret, but I did not allow myself to soften the way I once would have. I understood now that understanding alone is not enough. It must be followed by change. And change begins with clear boundaries. I told them I was willing to love, willing to stay, willing to heal, but I was no longer willing to endure. Perhaps the hardest part was not speaking the words but holding firm to them. There is still a tender part of me, one long accustomed to stepping back just to keep the peace. At times, all it took was a sorrowful look from my mother, or a quiet sigh from my father, and I would feel the urge to take everything back. But then I would remember the long nights alone, the cold meals, the silent ways I had comforted myself. And I understood that if I stepped back again, I would once more lose myself. I began learning to say no, slowly, calmly. No to unconscious comparisons. No to decisions made on my behalf. No to having my feelings set aside in the name of harmony. Each time, my heart trembled slightly, yet it also felt a little lighter, as if an old, tightened knot were gradually being undone. I did not build boundaries to create distance, but to preserve respect. I wanted to be loved, but with a love that listens, that acknowledges, that makes room for me to exist fully. I did not need to stand at the center. I only needed not to be pushed to the margins. And in the moment I claimed that truth for myself, I felt a quiet ache. All those years, what I lacked was not love itself, but fairness within that love. Yet from that very ache, I learned to stand straighter, steadier, to walk forward without lowering my head, without shrinking myself, without accepting disregard ever again. There are people who pass through our lives quietly without noise, without dazzling traces, yet silently hold up an entire world behind the scenes. They do not stand at the center of praise. They are absent from moments of glory. Their names are rarely spoken. And yet, they are often the ones who love most deeply, because their love does not require recognition to exist. Those who sacrifice in silence seldom speak of their exhaustion. They grow used to swallowing their burdens, accepting endurance as a natural extension of love. When others sleep peacefully, they remain awake. When others feel secure, they are still worrying. They choose to carry the heaviest share so that someone they cherish may walk a little lighter. In that quiet devotion, they turn themselves into a pillar of support even when they themselves have no one to lean on. Silent love is not loud, but it is steadfast. It reveals itself in small, almost ordinary gestures: money sent on time without fail, a brief call simply to check in, the best portion of a meal given to someone else, a dream quietly set aside without complaint. Each act alone may seem insignificant, but